All right, good morning here from the East Coast, and good afternoon to Harley there in Potsdam, Germany, and hello to everyone around the world. Thank you for joining us here at McDuff Lives for another, what I find the highlight of my week, a chance to actually pick one of the great brains in our world, Mr. Harley Schlanger, and I think you just blushed on when I said that, but it's really true. I'm so grateful, Harley. Thanks for joining me again.
Well, I always enjoy talking with you, John, because you're not only well informed, but you're curious and you have an imagination, and that's what human beings should be like. So we have a human to human contact.
Well, shall we start with the sublime or the ridiculous today?
I think they've merged. Well, I assume you're talking about the Twitter uh, bombshell, but I want to focus on one part of it that is not getting as much attention as it should. I mean, I think the story as a whole, uh, most people already knew or suspected that there was a media cover up on the Hunter Biden case and that Twitter was involved and probably the intelligence community was involved. And now we find out from the documents released by Elon Musk that Matt Taibbi is writing up that, in fact, there were constant meetings between the person who is the head of site integrity at Twitter had with the director of national intelligence. Uh, this is, of course, in the Obama administration, with the Department of Homeland Security and with the FBI. But there are two things that stand out to me on this whole story. One is the role of James Baker, who was the general counsel to the FBI during the whole Russiagate story. And he was very close to McCabe from the FBI, close to the adulterous twins who were doing the Operation Crossfire Hurricane. You know, the Baker was one of the people who had to vet the document, the dirty dossier from Christopher Steele and MI6. So the fact that when he resigned from the FBI in May 2018, where does he end up? The lead counsel of Twitter. And he was one of the people who advised Twitter that it was okay to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop. He said caution is warranted. Now, why didn't he have caution on the Christopher Steele dossier, which, of course, was a complete fraud, which he allowed to go through? But with the story that was true on Hunter Biden, you have to have caution. You can't go with it. So that's one point we can pick up. But the other one, to me, that is most astounding is that as this whole thing was unfolding in October of 2020, in real time in a presidential race, a group of 50 plus intelligence operatives, mostly former, including John Brennan, the head of the CIA, Mike Morrell, Michael Hayden, Leon Panetta, who had been Obama's CIA director. These people put out a letter in which they not only dismissed the question of Hunter Biden's laptop, but they said it has, quote, all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation, unquote. Now, these are the people who are tasked by our government to keep us safe, to do intelligence work, to keep an eye on the bad guys. And what we find out is that these are the bad guys. You know, when they tell us about what Putin's doing and what the Chinese are doing and what all these bad actors are doing, then you turn around and what do you see? This is what we're doing. This is what the US is doing. Who's doing the lying? It's coming from our intelligence agency. So the very people that we trust to keep us safe have once again been exposed as part of an operation against an election process, which they claimed was being tampered with by Russia, when it's now clear that there was no Russian interference in 2016, no Russian interference in 2020, but there was a hell of a lot of CIA and FBI and NSC and MI6 and GCHQ interference. So where's the penalty for these guys? And I think this is the urgent question, because these are the people advising Biden to not negotiate with Putin on the Ukraine situation. They're the ones who are saying Ukraine is winning and Russia is losing. They're the ones who are saying we have to go into wartime austerity to provide more weapons to kill off the Ukrainian people who are supposedly supporting because they're free and democratic, when in fact, they're the least democratic country in Europe. If you want an example of hypocrisy, look at the second summit of democracy that's coming up, which has these five pillars of the democratic state. Every single one of them, Ukraine is in violation of. And yet they're saying this is what Russia and China are in violation of. So I think what we see from these Twitter files is just how corrupt our system is, how far gone it is. And the only question is, why is there not more of an outrage that this was done? And I don't mean an outrage from Donald Trump or for Donald Trump, but for the American system, for our Constitution. Forget Donald Trump for a moment, although he was definitely a victim in this case, but forget that. The victim was the American people and the American system. And if this continues, there won't be an American system, an American Constitution. So to me, that's the takeaway from the Matt Taibbi release from thanks to Elon Musk, who, you don't have to like Elon Musk to appreciate the fact that he's willing to open the door and let the air and sunshine come in, which of course the Washington Post says it does. The Post slogan, democracy dies in darkness. There's no more dark, dank place than the editorial offices of the Washington Post. So that's my opening rant, John.
As you know, Harley, the Catholic Church for centuries, probably even approaching more than a millennia, has had a censorship process in which you can't publish a book, or a Catholic can't read a book unless it has a imprimatur on it. That is a stamp of approval by the Pope or the Pope's committee for the Committee on Christian Doctrine, or whatever it was. And that may have dissipated by now. But the rule has always been that the state, or in the case of the church, the church in its imperial form, its secular duties, can control information.
Yeah.
And this goes on into the British Empire. I was just noticing that Oliver Cromwell had a minister of censorship, or a censor, official censor, so that makes sure that people didn't, read things that might not go along with what the government was saying. And during a civil war, that's important. And in fact, I also know from other studies that in the South, in the Civil War, the American Civil War, the post services were forbidden from delivering northern newspapers. The people of the South did not have the chance to read what was the northern perspective on everything. So now we in this country have a completely new and different system, which is exactly what is at stake in the Twitter wars. The Twittergate thing is, will the people pick up the torch of liberty and march with it and say, we have got to have the right to honest information. And if the press doesn't give it to us, then we need to have a redress of our grievances by going to the government and saying, hey, what's up? Why don't you straighten out the public record and tell us what's really going on? Well, on top of that, you have the effect of a century of Bernays and Lippmann, and the whole idea of people like Harry, President Wilson and Colonel House, that it's okay, and matter of fact, necessary to create a narrative to lead the people along with, because the people are simply too uneducated, too untrustworthy, and too dangerous to give the truth. So there we are back to a few good men. You can't handle the truth. You can't handle the truth, Harley. So why should we tell it to you? And that I think is what John Brennan, who I think was the model for the gargoyles on European cathedrals. Just to look at him, he looks like he looks in the mirror every day to try to imitate the most ugliest gargoyle on Notre Dame or something. Well, anyway, those guys have formed this little cabal behind the scenes. Well, is it not just a continuance of the whole uh, uh, craziness that we've been suffering under since World War II and the death of President Roosevelt and the takeover of our institutions by the CIA? I was watching Jeffrey Sachs, who I never really knew much about Jeffrey Sachs, but he's out everywhere talking about COVID and all this stuff. But he's saying that it all starts in 1947, National Security Act, creation of the CIA, and the grievous error of allowing the CIA to basically have its own brief to do whatever it felt was necessary, not just gather information, but create wars around the world and assassinations and you name it. So that's where I'm at with this whole thing, is that this has been going on since the World War II division between the FDR type of future and the Dulles brothers, Sullivan and Cromwell future. That it brings me to my deeper question was, how was it in the 50s that those two competing ideas were allowed to exist at the same time? You had John Foster Dulles saying you're better dead than red, that there's no way that we can ever compromise. We must absolutely never do business in any way with the Soviet Union. And then you have the Harvard crew and Kissinger and all of these people who are completely in bed with the Soviet Union, and their scientists are going back and forth and they're trading their secrets, and all of this stuff is going on at the same time. And I wonder, is this because Dulles and the Wall Street crowd knew it was going on and it suited them to create this Hegelian dialectic? Or was it that they really were threatened by this, and there really has been a war between these two sides ever since? Which brings me right back to the question of President Trump and why was it so necessary that the intelligence agencies and all of their cronies get together and form this cabal of lying to lie to the American people? Where how big a threat was Trump really to what's been going on for at least 60 or 70 years? Okay, that's my rant.
All right. Well, there are a few things I'll pick up on that. On the Trump thing, this is where you have to have an internationalist perspective. That is, you have to look beyond the United States and actors from the United States. The impetus against Trump was not from American interests. It's arguably the case that he was promoted by CBS, CNN, by the media, which gave him so much attention. Now, whether they thought that would destroy him or whether they were looking for ratings or whatever, his real opposition came from the City of London. And the best evidence for that that I can give you is that the initiation of Russiagate came from GCHQ, Robert Hannigan, who came over, and GCHQ is the NSA equivalent, National Security Agency equivalent in Great Britain. They're the cyber warfare experts. Hannigan came to the United States, and he didn't go to the NSA. He went to John Brennan because he knew who Brennan was and what Brennan's inclinations were. He also knew Brennan was close to Obama. And he went to Brennan and said, look, we're picking up unusual cyber activity, which tells us Russia's preparing to intervene in the US elections. And that was the trigger point for Brennan and later Comey to unleash the intelligence community with the whole Russiagate story. Now, integral for that was also the role of former MI6 operative Christopher Steele, who is backed up by Sir Richard Dearloffe, who is the former head of MI6, but is now on numerous London-based corporate boards, the Atlantic Council, the RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, the group of think tanks that had as their patron Queen Elizabeth. I'm sure King Charles is now their patron, but that they're directly connected then to what? The House of Lords. And I know Americans say, oh, this is pomp and circumstance. It has nothing to do with anything. These are the richest people in the world who have connections in every bank in the United States, every major international corporation. And it was the City of London, through the House of Lords in December 2018, that produced a report. And we were the only ones who reported this. They produced a report that said, if Trump is reelected, the special relationship is dead. Now, what's the importance of the special relationship? That's what you were just talking about. Go back to the end of World War II. It was Churchill infiltrating what had been Roosevelt's team with British operatives. Now, that brings up the question of the Dulles. Were the Dulleses really so anti-communist, or did they just play a different role? You know, one thing you learn about the British is they'll play both sides on everything. As Lord Palmerston said, we have no permanent friends, only permanent interests. And so the Dulles brothers were close to the 120 Broadway crowd, which included Schultz's father. It included Armand Hammer, who was considered a friend of the Bolsheviks. It included Harriman, who was considered at least someone who could talk to the Bolsheviks. It included Prescott Bush, who was sort of not exactly an anti-communist, but certainly a pro-Nazi. So you had this ruling elite that was on both left and right. That's what synarchy is, John. And that's why I don't see a contradiction between the Dulleses saying better dead than red and Armand Hammer saying, no, let's sell pencils to the Russians and to the Soviets and make money on it. Kissinger's the same way. Kissinger once said, look, there are 800 million Chinese. If they have a headache once a year, that's 800 million aspirin we can sell. You know, we're talking about people who don't see the human quality in nations or in their opponents, only see their interests. And I think that's the starting point of this problem. Now, to go back to the House of Lords, what was the important thing about the special relationship? At the end of World War II, Franklin Roosevelt was looking at what he called the four freedoms and how the United States could use the United Nations as the basis for establishing a security and financial architecture that would address poverty in the world, that would address inequality in the world, that would address the legacy of colonialism. Now, who was the American political leader after FDR who was most concerned with overcoming colonialism? It was John Kennedy. And he gave speeches in the Senate in the late 1950s in support of Algerian independence, in support of Congo independence. He was marked by British intelligence as a potentially dangerous figure because of his support for the liberation movements, the anti-colonial movements in those countries. Now, what's emerging today against the unipolar order? It's these very same countries that were the ones waging war against the colonial powers in the 50s and 60s. So I don't find it contradictory that in the 50s and 60s, you could still have debates on these things and arguments on these things, because there still was a Franklin Roosevelt tradition among at least a segment of the World War II veterans who came back. They'd given up 5 years of their lives. They've seen many of their friends and family, brothers and fathers killed in the war. And what did they say? They said, we have to do something to make this world better so we don't do this again. And they ran up against the Wall Street faction that was committed to an alliance with Britain to protect the colonial system. Now, this came to my attention again yesterday. Someone sent me an interesting article from something called UK Declassified. And it's a paper that came out at the end of November. What do you think's happening in Libya right now? Well, Royal Dutch Shell and British Petroleum just signed the largest oil contracts in history. Now, who overthrew Gaddafi? Who organized the NATO operation in Libya? It came out of London and David Cameron, who roped his buddy Hillary Clinton into it. And he's always willing to go along with something like that because he was basically a stooge of the British. So we see this same question of the special relationship again and again and again. And yet people who should know better still say, oh, the Brits, they're nothing, they have nothing. As long as there's a city of London, they have tentacles in every major financial institution in the United States, every major corporate cartel in the United States. And that's what the real enemy of the American system is. That's what Eisenhower warned about on the military-industrial complex. That's why Kennedy was focused on doing something to bust up the CIA. I think had John Kennedy lived and not been killed by those people and had a second term, he would have relied on people like your father to tear apart the CIA, which he said he intended to do. So I think we have the principalities of power, as it talks about in the Bible. What are we talking about? We're talking about the corporate monoliths on both sides of the Atlantic that exist as entities to themselves and believe that they're entitled to wield the power to determine policies in every nation of the world. That's why they oppose sovereignty. And so, there's a whole lot more we can discuss and flesh this out. But I think that's why I don't see a contradiction between the Dulles brothers and the New York oligarchs and British oligarchs who worked with the Russians. The British had a lot to do with the Bolshevik Revolution. There were some decent things in the Bolshevik Revolution. There were some people among the Bolsheviks who really wanted to destroy Wall Street. And these were the ones that Stalin was told by the British operatives in his own party to get rid of, including in the military. So this is a fight that's gone on. I mean, it predates World War II, but especially since World War II, it's the Roosevelt networks. And Roosevelt did reflect imperfectly, but nevertheless did reflect the tradition of Alexander Hamilton and the American founding fathers. And the other side was the side of John Locke and the City of London and the British East India Company.
Well, that was a very fruitful question I asked there. I appreciate all of that, and all of the Hegelian dialectic that comes through from what you said is that, yeah, they've been manipulating us from here, from there, from all around, but it's always the elites, whether of the old Habsburg Empire or the British Empire or Wall Street or California, or whoever as the elites are going to work together. That's, as you say, the synarchy. The special.
And John, let me just go back a little bit further because I think it's worth. I know you appreciate it, and I think the best thinkers in your audience appreciate it also, because some of them are writing to me and thanking me for bringing these kinds of things up. The beginning, the origin of this was the fight between the original Tudor monarch, Henry VII, and the people who, after Henry died, and Henry was basically a Republican in a sense, in that he understood the need for what we would call today an industrial policy, with the state defending manufacturing, craftsmen, and so on, and defending trade, and having a national budget. And he was opposed by people who largely used Henry VIII to launch wars and kill off their opposition. But at the center of this fight, interestingly, were two great writers, Christopher Marlowe, who was killed by the imperial faction, and Shakespeare, who was clever enough to figure out a way to write his plays so that the powers that be thought they were glorifying them, when in fact he was really writing about something very different. He was providing a strategic map for understanding the psychological problems that are involved in running an empire. Now, it was in that period that something was launched a little bit later in Oxford University at the basement of one of the buildings called the Ashmolean Museum. Elias Ashmole, who founded modern British Freemasonry. And people have all these theories about Freemasonry. Essentially, what it was a group of people who conspired to figure out how to control the narrative long before social media, how to control the narrative so that you can keep people stupid and under your sway. And that's what Ashmole was all about. And that was the intelligence operation that was set up on behalf of the British Empire, paid for by the British East India Company. And it included people such as Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jeremy Bentham, these people who were supposedly the great democratic constitutional tradition of Britain. They were nothing of the sort. Locke, in particular, was an empiricist. He said, you can't have an original idea. It's all there. Your ideas are shaped by your senses, as opposed to your ability to make a creative discovery. And that was the fight that later on went on between Leibniz and Newton, where Newton was a part of this British imperial tradition, and Leibniz instead was a thinker in the tradition of Nicholas of Cusa, Leonardo da Vinci, the artists, scientists of the Renaissance. And that's the other part of the fight, because intelligence warfare was carried out by intellectuals, by writers, by musicians. Mozart, Haydn, these were people who were at the center of the emergence or the attempt to, after the American Revolution, bring the ideas of the American Revolution to Europe. They were beaten. They were defeated. Mozart was probably murdered. You have all these great musicians like Schubert, who died very young, people who were creating incredibly poignant works that when you listen to them, that they have you yearning for something beyond the senses, beyond the simple one-to-one kinetic relationship, trying to figure out how this whole universe works. And these are the people who were constantly attacked and targeted and killed. And it's not a coincidence that really great artists often lived in poverty, because they were opposed by people who instead promoted the Richard Wagner and the Franz Liszt and the ones who had the flash and the bang, as opposed to the provocation of great thinking. So this is we're just starting to do some new work on this, John. You'll be fascinated when I want to talk to you a little bit about this idea of pre-bunking. Are you familiar with that now?
Never heard it, no.
All right. Well, this is really NATO or the European Union has just realized that there's a better way than debunking. In other words, the idea of information warfare until recently, as practiced by the European Union, was you find out who's spreading the narratives you don't like, and then you debunk them.
Right.
Well, now they're saying, no, you have to pre-bunk. You have to change the way people think by cutting them off from ideas that go against the mainstream ideas, to censor. For example, if you say that, as Macron just said, that Putin has legitimate security demands, that has to be pre-bunked. That has to be written out of the discussion. You can't say it. And they're doing this now in high school and the equivalent of junior high in the European Union. And the project for this in the United States is in the state of New Jersey, where they're essentially saying there are ideas which must not be allowed to get into circulation. And this is building on the work of Bertrand Russell, who basically said if you say snow is black often enough, you can eventually get people to look at snow and see at least something that's gray. So we're seeing just think of the term pre-bunk. So before you get a narrative, you wipe out the possibility that could exist in someone's mind. And so they have a whole list of these things you can't say, like uh, Putin had some legitimate ideas about security, or that Ukraine has Nazis. They're not even arguing they do or don't. They're saying you can't say that. And this is why the Twitter fight in the United States takes on a special importance, because what we're really fighting is an attempt to remove truth from the discussion and have only an accepted set of beliefs. Now, I brought up earlier this summit of democracy. You remember that last year in December? At the same time, Putin was trying to get Biden to negotiate with him on Russian security interests. There was this December 9th and 10th Summit for Democracy, and they laid out something called the 5 pillars for a presidential initiative for democracy renewal. And now they just announced that in March 2023, there'll be the second Summit for Democracy to see how well these are working. Now, just listen to these pillars and think in your mind, they're promoting Ukraine as a democracy. Now, how many of these pillars describe the situation in Ukraine? Number 1, supporting free and independent media. This is a necessity for democracy. Well, I mean, Ukraine, it's obvious. They've shut down all the opposition press. But what does the Twitter story tell us about the West? Do we have a free press? So the first pillar for democracy is not existent in the Western world. The second one, fighting corruption. Now, everyone knows Ukraine is the most corrupt country in Europe. But look at the other countries. Look at the United States. Look at the control of the financial system by the private banks. The next one, bolstering democratic reformers. If you're an actual democratic reformer, you're smeared, slandered, and destroyed, as they did with Lyndon LaRouche. The next one, advancing technology for democracy. Well, they're putting, because of Silicon Valley's alliance with the military-industrial complex, they're putting the most powerful communication tools in the hands of the people who put out the lying narratives and censor the truth. And the final pillar, defending free and fair elections and inclusive political processes. This is supposedly what defines Western democracy. Could you find a better list of things they don't do? I mean, this is how far this control of the mind, the mind control stuff is going.
Well, trust the science, Harley. I mean, the science says that, the human mind can only handle so much. Cognitive dissonance can hurt. And, don't try to maintain 2 different ideas at the same time. That would really be painful.
Well,
Oh,
here's another interesting one, John. If you think about all of a sudden the great cheerleaders of the anti-maskers in China, and it turns out that the anti-mask movement is not nearly as big and prevalent as the media has been reporting, but the media reports this as a great burst of freedom. Well, what do they say about the anti-maskers in the United States? Ignorant, disease-spreading lunatics.
right.
So when you say you can't keep 2 different ideas at the same time, that's an example of it.
Okay. Well done. And it's true. Those of us that take the time to step back and look at these ironic, contradictions in the message, see through it. But so many people just don't. I'm discouraged by many posts that I see lately, where, well, for instance, one of my favorite history guys, Tik, who I really think he's a deep, deep thinker. But he put up one yesterday where he says, well, one of his subscribers asked the question, why do most people just accept the propaganda? Why do they go along with stuff that's just not reasonable? How did they get away with it? And his short answer was that most people don't think. They've been trained not to think. They've been trained to react emotionally at the very first encounter with something that's challenging. And I'm afraid that that may be the result of our educational system and the separation of parents from children at early ages, and not learning the idea of, hey, wait a minute, step back and think about it. Is this really the case? Is the way Tick puts it. This is what you've heard. Now, is it really the case? And then let's get into the details.
But
People.
that's how pre-bunking works, John. You don't even allow people to think there might be another way of thinking.
Hmm.
That there's only one way. It's like the one size fits all of the neoliberal system. What's the basis of the sole superpower, unipolar world, rules-based order? It's that the only way economic progress takes place is through a radical free market policy with no regulation, privatization, and no sovereign nations. And anyone who says something different is a communist, a fascist, a disruptor. When the fact of the matter is, it's provable that this unipolar order is collapsing, threatening the lives of hundreds of millions of people. But if you say that, you're an alarmist, you're missing the fact that all of this misery was caused by Vladimir Putin. And I have to say, Putin, it's a good thing he has a sense of humor, because he was just meeting the other day with some people, and someone asked him, how do you put up with all this being blamed for everything? And he said, well, I take it as a badge of honor. I must be the most powerful person in the world.
Well, it does. He does serve as the the poster boy for evil in the great narrative. I encountered a friend of mine, a very astute man, who's I posted a comment about the Donbass and about how the people of the Donbass have been being shelled. The civilians being shelled by their own government in Ukraine since 2014, and the Russia's there to try to protect them, and that kind of a thing. And my friend, just jumped right in and said, "Sorry, John, I can't buy that. That's like what would happen if if there was Russian people living on the eastern shore of Maryland, and Russia came and started bombing them. Do you think they'd like that?"
When you talk about these disconnects from reason, here's another one for you. Jake Tapper, the well-known voice of the mainstream media from CNN, was interviewing Blinken. And he managed to make Blinken look almost human, because he was asking Blinken, why doesn't the Biden administration declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism? Look what they're doing in Ukraine with the power plants and the electricity grid. Now, what Blinken said is, well, if you make that designation, there are consequences that we don't want to, that you can't predict and that we don't want to deal with. Now, what are the consequences? Well, if you say that it's a crime against humanity to bomb power plants, what did the U.S. do in Iraq twice? What did we do in Libya? What did we do in Serbia? What did we do in Afghanistan? What did we do in Yemen? Then the United States, by that designation, and by the way, this would be true, is the leading state sponsor of terrorism. So, this is another example of, and Tapper looked at Blinken as though he suddenly got wobbly in the knees and was becoming Putin's protector. But that's exactly what you're talking about. The idea of the Russians somehow bombing the eastern shore of Maryland. It's just people lose their senses on these things. There's reason.
And the idea of there being Nazis in Ukraine is just completely off the table. Those are just old symbols. They don't mean anything.
Well, then why did we have to take down the Confederate flags? Because the same people who were defending the Nazi symbols in Ukraine were the ones who went apoplectic over the Confederate flags. They're inconsistent in their own warped view. So, it's just,
Yeah.
here's another point. Macron, the French president, is under attack in Europe for suggesting that perhaps Putin had some legitimate security guarantees, that he was concerned about NATO weapons coming up to the borders of Russia, and we should have talked to him about it.
Right.
Well, where the hell was Macron when Putin was asking for that discussion last year, or in 2015, or in 2016, or 2018? I think Macron came in 2018. So where was Macron then? Why did he not bring that up then? And then the other point is, he's saying, so maybe we should have that discussion. And he said, but we still have to leave it up to the Ukrainians. Well, the chief Ukrainian negotiator said yesterday, oh, we're open to negotiate with the Russians with two preconditions. They leave all territory in Ukraine and they voluntarily give up their nuclear weapons. So they do that, then we'll discuss security guarantees with them.
Yeah.
Now, Macron knows that the Ukrainians are not, at least the party in power, is not going to negotiate. And the question is, how long can people like Macron keep playing these games and have the French population go along with them? How long can Schultz do this in Germany? What boggles my mind is the fact that people who are suffering for reasons that are not their own fault, and they should not be suffering for, like the lack of electricity, the high price of fuel in all of Europe now, the high price of food. Eggs are now about $6 a dozen at German supermarkets.
Yeah.
Butter has tripled in price. What did Putin do? Destroy all the cows that produce milk? But the fact that people take it and they hear these things said by politicians, they know they're idiots, they know it's BS, and yet they don't do anything. And that's why there's a legitimate reason to be despairing. But I would put it the other way. That's why we have to be louder, more consistent, and more creative in finding ways to make these ironies get under people's skin so they start realizing that they're tolerating something that they should never tolerate.
Well, that's a good connection to the other substantive question I wanted to raise today with you, and it's a country that's very, very important, very, very small, and very, very much in the news lately that you and I have not really talked about much, and that is the Netherlands. The Netherlands policy is now full on World Economic Forum cut back. Individual farms, cut back on farming generally, and
Seize the farms, yeah.
yeah. And so you said, well, why is the price of eggs and butter going up? Well, obviously it's Putin's fault. Science tells us that. But aside from the scientific reality of Putin causing everything that goes wrong in this world, the Dutch government has a hand in it too. And it reminds me of, we talk about the effect of the Williamite Revolution and the division between the two kingdoms, the James II versus William of Orange, and the consequences of that. Well, the Williamite didn't last very long because they brought in the Hanovers. But I was thinking, even though they brought in these Hanover people, the Dutch are probably still running the show. And
John, that's really important, because before there were the British, there was the Dutch monarchy, the Dutch East India Company, the Bank of Amsterdam was the first of the private banks. But you know what it was? It was the migration from Venice. The Venetian Empire was collapsing in the period of the 16th century and early 17th century. And it became clear to the people of Venice that they could not sustain an empire from that portion geographically in Europe. And so the Venetians, who had ties to the Vatican, they had ties to the old European nobility, to the German banking families like the Fuggers. What they did is they looked for a place where they could have an empire. And the first place they went to was the Netherlands and started to build up there. And at a certain point, they saw England as a more propitious geographic location for an empire. And that's the importance of the William and Mary Orange Revolution and the glorious 1688 revolution. And you're right, that bloodline didn't last, but the policy did. It was private banking. It was looting Africa. And they found that England was a better place from which to carry out that looting, although they had to fight the Spanish to eventually make sure that it was England rather than Spain that was the dominant force. So, I mean, that's really insightful. And the Dutch, I mentioned the Libya situation. It's British Petroleum and Royal Dutch Shell. The operations in Iran in the early 50s, British Petroleum, Royal Dutch Shell. They are partners very, very often in the control of things. So that's an interesting point you brought up.
Well, thank you.
And, and by the way, on the farm question,
yeah,
Dutch farmers may be the spark to change things in Europe, because I think it's 30% of Dutch farmers were just told they have to leave their land.
Yeah.
They have to sell it.
3,000 farms,
Yeah.
according to the report. And that's just horrible. And the guys get out there with their tractors on the road. And of course, the government has a big yellow tractors that are bigger than the farm tractors with big scoops on the front of them. And they just scoop those tractors up. And so the farmers are having a hard time maintaining their protest, especially when the government also has vans full of black-clad quasi-police that come jumping out of a van anytime the farmers get active. And so I'm really concerned about that, because it seems to be the core of where the fight is right now. Is there enough hope for liberty that that this Dutch situation may turn into a popular movement that forces the hand to back down? But the propaganda, is that, well, they're using too many fertilizers, and we've got to save the earth. So
and the Dutch farmers are too rich because they're such good farmers. I mean, this is besides Ukraine, the Dutch farmland is some of the best and most fertile and most well-used land in Europe.
Yeah,
and they are scientific. They're not destroying the land by producing good crops. There are natural ways that you can keep the nutrients in the soil and so on. And the Dutch and German and French, I took some American farmers who had these huge farms in Mississippi and Kansas. I took them to France in 1984 when we founded the Schiller Institute. And we went to visit a French dairy farmer. And he had 30 cattle, 30 milk cows. And the American dairy farmer had 150. And the 30 French cows produce as much milk as the American cows. Now, the American farmers are pretty productive. But the European farmers, because they have less land, have had to figure out ways to do things better. And the Americans were astonished at what they could learn from these farmers. Now, these are the farms that are being shut down. The land is being left unused and probably will be sold off to people like Bill Gates and Bezos and Archer Daniel Midland and Cargill and Pillsbury and the grain cartels, the way they're doing with Ukraine land now. Now, in contrast, what Putin is saying is that Russia is going to bring more land into cultivation because there's a need for more food. And Putin actually is inviting farmers from Europe to come move to Russia and almost doing a kind of American-style homesteading act you remember the land rush in Oklahoma and these things? Well, last year they invited a bunch of South African farmers to move to Russia, and they did. And Putin's driven by this idea that we need more food. And that's one of the reasons Russia is popular in the developing sector, in the global south. It's not that people in the global south just want to punch America in the nose, it's that they believe in production, they believe in taking care of people. And, I think that's the real fight, John. If you boil down what we're talking about, it's the question of love of mankind that differentiates an oligarchy, which despises anyone who might take a portion of their share, as opposed to real human beings who look in every child's eyes and see a potential genius, a potential producer, someone who can add to the beneficence of all of nature for all of mankind. And it's that dividing line that is the one where the fight is taking place. Fortunately, there are more of the latter type than there are of the oligarchs. But the oligarchs have enough money to buy an awful lot of people and soldiers and police. So you ask about Holland. The Dutch had an extremely active and aggressive farm series of demonstrations in August, and they said after the harvest at the end of September, they would do more. And the Dutch government used that time from the end of August to the end of September to come up with all kinds of measures to try and counter it, including what you're talking about, the equipment that can move the farm machinery off the roads, but also then money. So they can say to these guys, look, do you really want to fight us? We'll give you a good package of money if you just get off the land. And that's what they're doing.
And also, that's exactly what they're doing in Ukraine, with Zelensky basically being the broker for BlackRock to go to the farmers of Ukraine and say, "Hey, I get you the best price you'll ever see for this little plot of land, and you can retire and go live in the city and kick back."
Or if you want to keep farming, you can become a peasant, but you'll have a little bit of money as a cushion.
Right? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Let's go back to Diocletian.
Yeah.
It really is suspiciously the same area of the world where serfdom may never have actually died out. The attitude of the elites is, of course there's serfs, just like the attitude of the elites in slavery days. Of course there's slaves. Well, what else? What can we do without slaves? You couldn't grow your cotton without slaves. What are you, crazy? You know, that's just a mental
Well,
fixation.
and then you have Josep Borrell, the foreign minister of the European Union, saying Europe is a garden, the rest of the world is a jungle. And if you don't want to come here and be civilized and play by our rules in our garden, we'll send you back to the jungle.
The jungle of Rudyard Kipling.
Yeah.
The white man's burden is still a very, very heavy burden to, John Brennan and all the very, very intelligent people with all the tentacles and the bankers and the City of London and the Wall Street and the Stanford and all the usual suspects we often talk about. But it's, as you say, it's a big club, and we're not in it, but they are. The Trump versus Clinton fight, it appears to have been a real fight, but on the other hand, between two factions of a much larger production that has existed since World War II. If I understand, if you agree with what my comment is.
Well, as you know quite well, I defended the Trump potential against the deep state, so-called deep state, and the attempt to get rid of him.
Yeah.
But I did so expecting that he would actually fight them. And instead, he chose to do his thing and appeal to the American people. And some of what he did was good, some of what he did was inexcusable. And just one example of that, which maybe Elon Musk is going to try and fix, is the case of Julian Assange. Trump went along with the idea of extraditing Assange and trying him under the Espionage Act. He could have done an exoneration or a pardon or something, but he didn't. And now Biden is planning on bringing Assange here and try him under the Espionage Act, where he can't get a fair trial and he faces a death sentence in a U.S. prison. So where there could have been a difference, he could have gone apeshit against Brennan and Comey and others and really just forced the issue with the declassification. He didn't. He stuck by the rules and he listened to people like Bill Barr. And I think that's why we're in this mess we're in. And those people who think Donald Trump is the savior, I hate to tell you, the people who are thinking that are condemning themselves to more of the same. And if you want to win this fight, get out there on your own, become educated, become an activist, organize people, educate them, use these ironies that John and I have been kicking around to show people what the truth is.
Well, tonight we're going to have a special guest. Diane Sayre will be joining me 8 p.m. East Coast time here for my double-header LaRouche Day. LaRouche here at McDuff Lives, and I'm very proud to do what I can to support Diane Sayre's candidacy against Senator Gillibrand, one of the real interesting and somebody that I think maybe not as famous as Schumer, but somebody that may earn our respect as an opponent, and somebody that really Diane deserves great kudos for taking on. So I look forward to seeing Diane tonight. And Harley, it's always such a pleasure. Thank you very much.
See you in 2 weeks, John.